been evidence of a refusal to recognize this problem. So what has the government done? First there was denial, right? When Godrej and Bajaj and the biscuit manufacturers came and said biscuits are not, even the 5 rupee packets are not selling, cars aren't selling. First there was this denial. Then there was this really silly comment about how millennials, go in Uber and Ola, not recognizing that the automobile crisis had to do much more with trucks and buses and heavy vehicles as well. Then came a press conference, a little later beyond this, because the pressure was mounting. And I want you to recall, it's very significant, the announcement made at that press conference by the finance minister. The industry leaders had asked for GST cuts, other concessions and so on, but little of that came. On GST, the finance minister said this has to go to the GST council. She didn't oblige them. She did make some statement about some minor concessions to the auto sector, but she made one significant concession in that conference, which was to remove the surcharge on the capital gains tax that she had imposed just a couple of months earlier in July on foreign portfolio investors who brought in money and made money on the stock market. This was the only gesture she did. This was for foreign portfolio capital coming into the Indian economy. You must ask why. How come big Indian corporates make certain suggestions, those are ignored, but foreign finance capital is immediately obliged? Well, I think this is important, and this is something we have all written about over the years, Jayati, myself, Chandru, all of us have been writing about, Prabhat in particular. You see, over the last 30 years, I don't think there's a single quarter where the value of India's exports of physical goods has exceeded the value of imports of physical goods by India. So we have a permanent merchandise trade deficit, as economists call it, dealing only with goods, not talking about services. Consistently over the neoliberal reform period, we have run a merchandise trade deficit. This has been quite huge at times. In fact, in 2012-13, this merchandise trade deficit was almost 10% of GDP, exceptionally high figure. Now, a part of this is made up by our net exports in the services sector. We have net exports in services, IT-enabled services, tourism. These bring you some foreign exchange. So they partly fill the hole that you have in the merchandise trade deficit. Another bigger contribution comes from remittances by Indian working people abroad. Not the Modis and the Malyas, but not the ones who put money in Swiss banks, but ordinary working people from Kerala, from Tamil Nadu, from Bihar, who go to relatively difficult foreign sites of work, away from their families, but send all the money back home for their family's expenditures, something you're very familiar with in Kerala for a very long time. These remittances by Indian workers abroad and other remittances from abroad together fill another part of the big gap which comes from the merchandise trade deficit. Still not enough. So you have a current account deficit, what economists like to call a current account deficit, which has been quite significant through most of this period, exceptionally high in that period of 2012-13 when it became 4.6% of GDP, but even now it's about 2.25% thereabouts of GDP, and that's a very large amount. What does this imply for the lay person? This means that since foreigners won't sell you goods for rupees, you need foreign exchange to buy anything from abroad, right? So every single day, every single hour, every single minute, the Indian economy is desperately seeking dollars because you have a current account deficit. Therefore, you are willing to accept foreign capital as finance coming into the country on any terms whatsoever. This portfolio capital that comes in does not add to the country's wealth. It does not bring in new technology. It creates no employment. It's purely a speculative phenomenon in the stock markets and commodity markets. And yet you're so desperate to have them. You're willing to respond to them first before you respond to your own corporate sector demands. This is the outcome of a long period of trade liberalization that we are facing this problem. You see, in fact, when you talk about the economic crisis today, it is an eerie reminder of 1991. Jayati said it's even worse than 1991, and that's correct. But look at the two problems that were signaled in 91. The fiscal crisis of the state doesn't have enough resources to meet its expenditures. The foreign exchange crisis, balance of payments crisis. What are we saying today? We have fiscal crisis, we have balance of payments crisis. So what has changed? You guys told us that you will do all these things and you will make it nice for foreign capital to come in, the country will grow, poverty will disappear, employment will grow, and exports will exceed imports, and we'll be in the nirvana. But you're back exactly where you were in 91, except that you're much worse off. Your defenses are also lowered now because you're much more integrated into the world economy than you were in 1991. In 1991, the total of India's exports and imports was hardly 14% of GDP. Today it's well over half GDP, right? So you're really much more vulnerable today than you were in 1991. You have the same crisis. So to come back to the point about how the government is dealing with the slowdown in the economy, the numbers are all there. You're all familiar with it. The April-June 2018 quarter recorded 8% GDP increase. The April-June 2019 quarter recorded 5%. The July-September quarter recorded 7.5% in 18. In 2019, it is recording 4.5%. And of course, people like Arvind Subramaniam, who wrote our economic surveys and talked about 7 and 8% growth rates, now tells us these numbers are all wrong, that actually your 4.5 is more like 1.5 or 2, your 6% is more like 3 or 3.5, so you must cut off some 2 to 3 percentage points from what the government says. And the government, of course, happily doesn't even reveal figures wherever it can avoid revealing them. So we do have clearly, whatever the government might say, a clear evidence of a decline in the rate of growth of GDP. Technically, it is not negative GDP, although if it proceeds in this manner, it could become negative. And if you take into account the fudges in government's reporting of GDP growth rates, you're probably already fairly close to a state where the GDP growth rate is close to zero. But leaving aside those numbers, because we can all take it for granted that there is a significant slowdown in the economy, which can soon officially become a recession with a negative growth of GDP. The question I'm posing is, why is the government doing things that are exactly the opposite of what it should be doing? So what has it been doing? How is it dealing with this? Because of this fear of flight of foreign finance capital, we saw they responded to the portfolio investors and gave them concessions to hope that they'll come back and bring more money in here. Now, that doesn't automatically happen, because if the investors from abroad fear that the rupee is weakening, then they would be very hesitant to bring money in, because they bring dollars in, they take dollars out. In the meantime, the rupee has weakened against the dollar, they lose out, right? So they will not bring in dollars if they think the rupee is weakening. And in fact, the rupee has been weakening through much of this period. More recently, it has been gaining a bit, but that's a temporary phenomenon. In any event, some foreign capital inflows did come later, but for me, the most important thing to ask is, why are we having these large, persistent trade deficits, and why are we so, keen, therefore, to bring in foreign finance capital? That is what we've just seen, right? But to go beyond that, the desperation to bring foreign finance capital in is not only to meet your balance of payments deficits, which I've already mentioned, but it's also that one consequence of such a desire to keep, inviting and somehow keep attracting foreign portfolio capital in here, the one consequence of that is the government must limit its fiscal deficits, right? Now, this audience may not all be familiar with the term fiscal deficit, but it's a very political definition of a deficit. For a long time, we never talked about fiscal deficits. I remember in the 1970s, we didn't talk about fiscal deficits. The way the fiscal deficit is defined is to take all of expenditures on one side, current expenditure plus capital expenditure. But on the receipt side, the definition of the fiscal deficit excludes all borrowings. There's a very serious political question here. It basically delegitimizes government borrowing. In an economy where the private sector borrows hugely from publicly owned banks, the elected government is not allowed to borrow and regard that as legitimate receipts. So it's essentially the fiscal deficit criterion is actually a tool to promote privatization, essentially, because governments are forced to curtail their fiscal deficit, curtail their borrowing, and therefore they must necessarily keep pushing the economy more and more into private hands. Now, this is the agenda, because what the fiscal deficit criterion does is to render legitimate whatever government receives by selling its shares. Disinvestment receipts or capital receipts, they are legitimate. Borrowing is not. Look at the distinction. So it is clearly a tool. The political economy behind the stress on the fiscal deficit has to do with the agenda of privatization. And it's been happening quite a bit over the years. Now, if the government of India then is worried about the fiscal deficit and wants to keep it low, because if fiscal deficits were higher, international rating agencies like Standard & Poor or Moody's would then tell investors all over the world not to come to this country. There's a very active government, large fiscal deficit. What will happen to the rupee in a few months' time, we don't know. So you will be advised to not necessarily not come, but India's debt will be downgraded. India's bonds will be downgraded. So India as a destination will become less attractive for international finance capital. So the government panics. Every time fiscal deficits rise, it's scared that foreign capital will not come in. So what does it do? It tries to squeeze its expenditures to retain a low fiscal deficit. What has it done in the area of fiscal policy? What has this government done in the last 8 months? Jayati talked about the budget figures going all RI and practically meaningless. But let me just recall for you what she did. One press conference, there was this concession to foreign finance capital, right? Removal of the surcharge on their capital gains, on the tax on the capital gains. What is the second thing they did? In a later press conference, as pressure mounted again and again, this time they announced a 50,000 crore value of subsidy for exports and a 20,000 crore amount for real estate and housing, of which about 10,000 crores was to come from government directly and 10,000 from other sources. So 70,000 crores of subsidies of some kind to the corporate sector. This was followed in a later press conference, since nothing seemed to improve, by a much more impactful announcement, which was to reduce the corporate tax rate to 22%, independent of turnover. You see, there's a bit of a history here, because Arun Jaitley, in his earlier budget in 2016-17, had actually announced that all corporate entities, all companies with an annual turnover of 250 crore rupees or less will pay 25% tax instead of 30%. This was part of the promise that the BJP had made in the manifesto, that it would bring down corporate tax rates. He had also announced in the previous budget that wealth tax is abolished. Okay. Then Nirmala Sitharaman, when she became finance minister, said, why 250 crores? In July 2019, she said, let's make it 400 crores. Okay. As opposed to Jaitley's limit of 250 crores. This practically brought all companies, except the very large ones, in the 25% bracket. But when the crisis emerged, and although officially government has not admitted a crisis, the action is remarkable. In this press conference, the third press conference that I talked about, she actually announced that the corporate tax rate will be 22% for all corporate entities, no matter what the turnover is. And the loss to the government on this account was estimated at 1.45 lakh crores. Now you do the arithmetic. 50,000 exports, 20,000 real estate and housing, 1.45 lakh crores for corporate tax concession, 2.15 lakh crores. Now there goes all the money you squeezed out from the Reserve Bank. You squeezed out 1.76 lakh crores from the Reserve Bank, ostensibly to recapitalize banks and all that. Now it's 2.15 has gone the other way. So you again have a very severe problem. That is why states are being squeezed, not being paid their dues in GST. That is why programs are being cut. Even originally, even in that silly, meaningless budget of Nirmala Sitharaman, you may recall that the allocation for MNREGA was 60,000 crores, 1,000 crores less than the previous year, 61,000 crores. That too with arrears still remaining to be paid. So clearly, even the budget was very measly in its allocations for health, education, and rural development and so on. But it has become worse now. So with this, despite the cutbacks in expenditures and so on, the finance minister still has a problem, which is that she is not able to bring down the fiscal deficit to the extent that she thinks is necessary to keep attracting foreign finance capital. So what do? And that's where the significance of this seminar comes. Now the government is saying that the only way we can manage this is by selling public sector assets. That will bridge the deficit. So you guys are now directly on the radar of the government. How can we finish off the public sector, sell all its assets, and that can be used to bridge the deficits. This was not the original argument for privatization. You see, the original argument for privatization rested on notions of private sector being more efficient. And that, of course, has completely been blown up by the evidence from the private sector. So you can no longer claim that private sector is necessarily more efficient than public sector. That argument it will just be laughed at if you look at all the collapses of the private sector over the last several years. So now the argument is we need to sell public sector assets. We need disinvestment because we have budgeted for 1.05 lakh crores in this year's budget as receipts from disinvestment. This is on top of, in the Modi regime, 2014 to 19, the total disinvestment of public sector assets was 2.97 lakh crores. Roughly 60,000 crores a year. Okay? Now this is interesting because the pattern of disinvestment from the time of neoliberal reforms in 1991 is very interesting. 1991-96, the minority government of Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, which later purchased a majority by buying some Jharkhand MPs, that government disinvested 9,960 crores over 5 years, 91 to 96, roughly about 2,000 crores a year. Then the 2 years of the UF government, because they relied on support from the left, they didn't disinvest much. The total of disinvestment was 1,300 crores, 650 crores per year in 96-97, 97-98. Then came the big disinvestor, Vajpayee, NDA 1. 98 to 2004, they disinvested on an average 16,000 crores a year. All these figures are in 2019 rupee value. I've adjusted for price changes. 16,000 crores a year was the Vajpayee government's annual disinvestment amount. Then 2004-08, you may remember Jayati talked to you about how that was one brief window of growth. At that time, since UPA 1 was dependent on the left for support, and since the Common Minimum Program had said that profit-making PSUs will not be disinvested, there were some restraints on disinvestment. And in fact, in that period, 2004 to 8, the average disinvestment was about 4,200 crores a year. 1/4 of what it was in the Vajpayee regime. From 16,000 crores, it came down to 4,000 crores, but only till 2008. The moment UPA 2 came, it was no longer dependent on the support from the left, it went back on the spree of disinvestment. The 2009 to 14 disinvestment was 30,000 crores a year on the average, 1.51 lakh crores over the entire term, roughly 30,000 crores a year. But Modi said, this is nothing. I'm going to do 60,000 crores a year, and he's done that. So 30,000 to 60,000. So while both Congress and BJP governments have pretty much identical economic policies, the addition in the BJP case is, of course, utter stupidity, as in demonetization and in GST. And on top of that, a complete disregard for the critical role of the public sector in the Indian economy. And this is on that I'm going to speak for the rest of my presentation, but I wanted to build this up to you so that you see the context of massive disinvestment that is occurring today is occurring because the government is unwilling to tax the well-to-do. In fact, on the contrary, has been giving them a series of concessions. Imagine a country with the degree of inequality that we have, which has no wealth tax. I mean, it's horrendous. We have no wealth tax, we have no estate duty, we have rising inequality of assets across households, and we then reduce corporate tax rate to 22%. And we have no way of monitoring. You see, the ostensible claim is that this is 22% without claiming any exemptions. But that's the story, right? At the end of the day, we don't know what the corporates will do. And even if they don't pay this, what is the narrative we will get? Don't push them. Don't indulge in tax terrorism. We need them so desperately for growth. This is the narrative that we are facing, and we have to puncture this narrative. We have to puncture this notion that it is corporate investment that should drive the Indian economy. We should say, why the hell should corporate investment, which is profit-driven, drive the economy? Why can't the state play a role to keep the economy going? And many of us have kind of given up on it. We said, this is the climate in which all this will not have much attraction. There won't be traction for this. I'm saying we should actually say, it's high time you stopped mollycoddling corporates. It's high time the state played a more important role as an agent of development. It won't happen overnight, but we have to build an alternative narrative in the country to deal with that. So it is in that context that I want to briefly talk to you about the role of the public sector in the Indian economy. Something that many of us take for granted. I remember when we came into the movement in the late 70s, we talked about it a lot. We talked about what the Indian economy was like in 1950 and why the entire political spectrum, including Indian business leaders, recognized the need for a leading role for the state in development, and the public sector was a tool of that role of state as a development agent. So in the 50s, in a world which is very different from the world we see today, First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, 30 years of weakening of global capitalism, of some kind of a halting of its triumphant global march from the 19th century, left us in 1945 with a much weaker set of imperial nations than had been the case earlier. So weakening of imperialism was one feature of the 1945-50 period. The second feature was the rise of a powerful socialist camp. USSR and a whole set of other countries, and by the mid-50s, roughly about 1/6 of the world's territory and 1/3 of the world's population was under socialist regimes. So this is a period of great dramatic change. Two major developments: weakening of imperialism, the rise of a socialist camp, and the concomitant victory of national liberation movements across the world. Therefore, a global wave of decolonization. This was the context in which India set out on its development agenda in 1950. So at that time, looking at the experience of the USSR, not just in India, across the world, there was a clear recognition, even among US economists, there was a clear recognition that the state had a key role to play in development. And if you look at the Bombay plan that the industrialists put together in India, you can see the same arguments there. You can see that in Britain and France, nationalizations took place of major industries. So the whole climate was looking at Soviet achievements. State should play the role of development agent, and therefore public sector would have a key role to play in the Indian economy. This is how the whole story started. And there were many specific events and incidents which reinforced this. For example, in 1950, an Indian delegation went to Britain to seek support for building a steel plant in the public sector in India. I'm sure Ashok Rao must have told you this story at some point or the other. And this team went and met the chairman, British Board of Trade, and the apocryphal story says that he apparently asked, "You are a poor country. What are you going to do with steel? Are you going to eat it? If you want steel, we'll give it to you." So the British government denied assistance for a steel plant in the public sector. But they came back, and the Soviets came up with Billai. The moment Soviets came up with Billai steel plant, the Germans and the British rushed in for Durgapur and Rourkela. So this is the story of the steel industry, how public sector enterprises became critical to developing a large-scale steel industry in India. You can look at right now the candidate for disinvestment, Bharat Petroleum Corporation, BPRL. What is the Bharat Petroleum Refining Corporation? What was its history? In 1960, there was no oil refining capacity in the public sector. At that time, there were three major companies which had the capacity to refine oil. And, I speak as a chemical engineer here. These three companies were all multinational companies: Caltex, Esso, and Burma Shell. What did they do? Because we had restrictions on the repatriation of profits, these companies would source crude oil from their parent outfits at very high prices, posted prices, thus taking foreign exchange out as a raw material cost rather than as a profit item. Then they would be refining it and selling it here at high prices. Soviets offered us oil at much lower prices. So the companies were in a fix. They put forward the argument that Soviet oil is of very poor quality. It has high sulfur and all that, so we can't process it in our refineries. Now, if you're an engineer, you know that if you've got 10 million tons throughput, 500,000, 1 million of poorer quality is not going to make a difference. But point was not that. No, point is they were losing the profits they were making by over-invoicing the imports of crude from their parent outfits. So that was the time that it hit hard. The Indian planners that, look, we need to build refining capacity in the public sector. Immediately what did they do? They simply constituted, as the government of India always does, an oil price inquiry committee, which took a good 7 years to submit its report. Nehru was gone before that. But at least one thing happened, that we set up the Indian Oil Corporation in 1961. So if you look at the history of Indian industry, you will see that public sector played the most crucial role in preserving economic self-reliance, in enabling industrial growth through the 50s and 60s. Now, this role of the public sector was well recognized at that time. Public sector was not seen as an entity which should be judged solely in terms of profitability. Clearly recognized that public sector enterprises would have multiple objectives. They would have to, of course, create an infrastructure, supply infrastructure, which the private sector would benefit from. Let's have no illusions about this. In India, public sector is not a socialist island. Public sector was intended from the beginning to enable the private sector to make profits by providing them the necessary supplies at reasonable price, what are considered reasonable prices. So there was a heavy element of subsidy in the rates at which public sector enterprises sold the necessary inputs to the private sector at various points in time. And as Jayati had already made the point, that large industries requiring huge amounts of investment, taking long gestation lags to come on stream, where profitability could not be guaranteed, but nonetheless where these sectors were critical for all capitalist enterprises. These were taken up by the public sector. Energy, transport, communications, and social infrastructure, health and education, and financial infrastructure. I mean, she talked about the demise of development banking. What were the development banking entities? They were all intended to build a financial infrastructure. Remember that when we became independent, we just had the Imperial Bank of India and the RBI, and hardly anything else in banking. So what were the entities we set up? Today, all of them are, in the private sector. ICICI is now in the private sector. IFCI, IDBI, UTI, LIC. Now UTI has become Axis Bank. ICICI, which was used to save a private sector bank, Bank of Majura, has then been swallowed by the private sector subsequently. IDBI is on the verge of being privatized. So, you have, through the Congress and the BJP periods, a consistent drive to weaken the public sector in the financial sector as well. It's not an accident that this is happening. And I remember people like Rangarajan, who was governor, who was also chairman of Economic Council of Advisors. After they are out of office, they will lament that we shouldn't have done this to development banking, we should have had development banks and so on. This is a recurring story. Manmohan Singh out of office will say we were wrong in dealing with the steel industry as we did. All this realization will come when they're out of power and will go back the moment get back to office. So don't have any illusions about where these guys are going. They're not going anywhere other than where the BJP is going as far as economic policy is concerned. But we need to understand what is the fight we are in. We are in a fight to save the public sector, not on some trivial grounds. What is the argument for the public sector? Apart from the fact that it is the only sector that is accountable to the state and the people, apart from the fact that it has made all these massive investments in critical infrastructure at great cost. Remember, just look at these public sector factories. Just imagine the conditions under which working people went and built those factories. How did they live there when the factory was coming up? What are the fabrication units like? I mean, you look at some of these sites across the country, you were impressed. This is the country, if we had gone by the advice of neoclassical economics and said location should be decided by profitability, we would have had no public sector units in much of the country. So profitability is important, but not the only criterion. Public sector has to serve several other ends, and this is very clearly recognized. If you go back to the Industrial Policy Resolution of 48 or of 1956, or even much later, even through the 70s, the public sector continued to be recognized as extremely fundamentally important to Indian economy. 70s saw the nationalization of coal and oil sectors. The 50s saw the nationalization of insurance and banking. Banking nationalization came in late 60s. So, there was a series of measures setting up financial infrastructure which involved both setting up new institutions and bringing up big public sector entities in these sectors. So, it is not just industrial and manufacturing alone. Even in finance, even in education, even in healthcare, we take this for granted, you see. You have a literacy rate from 16% in 51 becoming 70% today. Didn't happen by the market. It happened through massive public investments in education, including creating a whole cadre of teachers. It's not just brick and mortar for the schools. You have to create a cadre of professionals. These things don't happen automatically. Same thing with the Food Corporation of India and the procurement infrastructure, storage facilities. Right now in this crisis, agriculture is crying out for support. If you really wanted to deal with the demand crisis, apart from expanding, as Jayati said, MNREGS and urban employment possibilities and so on, there is so much investment that agriculture needs. What about rural infrastructure? What about irrigation? What about storage facilities for farmers? What about improving the roads to the market for farmers? What about strengthening the extension system? What about strengthening the farm research system? What about strengthening the credit system? There's just so much to be done in agriculture and rural development alone today that if the government was willing, this would give a big boost to the economy and also in the process, not just increase demand, but improve supply conditions, improve productivity around. But this is what this government, this is the narrative this government rejects. Because remember what both Nirmala Sitharaman and Prime Minister said last year. In the budget, the Finance Minister said, corporates are the wealth creators in this country. Key words. And PM repeated that in his Independence Day address. From the time I've been a child, I've grown up thinking that nature and labor together, are needed for production of wealth. Labor works on nature and transforms it. That is how wealth is created. Now we are told that corporates are the creators of wealth. What is the world we are in? Unless you confront that narrative, unless you debunk it, you have to make it illegitimate. You delegitimize that kind of proposition. So we need a very powerful campaign from organizations like yours to talk to the people about why public sector is necessary, what it has done, and how it has performed the most difficult functions, even in telecom. What do we see happening around us? I was talking about it just before I came in. You had an Indian Petrochemicals Corporation Limited, the one of its kind in public sector. You handed it over to Reliance in the Vajpayee regime, by the way. During the Vajpayee regime, the IPCL was handed over to the Reliance company. So you created a monopoly in petrochemicals, a private monopoly in petrochemicals. Today you're doing that with telecommunications. Tomorrow you'll be doing that with ports with Adani, airports with Adani. So they've got parcels out for their cronies. Some for them A, some for B, some for C and all that. Some for A1 and A2 and then others to get the rest. We need to say to people of our country that this is ridiculous, that we can't allow this, that we need a very strong public sector. Even in the, brief first term that, Mrs. Gandhi lost the emergency, post-emergency lost the election. She came back in 80. Even up to 1984-85, there was no official rejection of the key role of the public sector in India's development. But with 85 comes the gradual transformation with the acceleration of reforms. You may remember when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister, all the new policies that were announced, new economic policy, new education policy, new textile policy, new XYZ. That was the starting point of the progressive decline of the public sector. If you look at the share of public sector in terms of assets in overall Indian industry or Indian economy, up to the 70s, it's still growing. It's only in the 80s it begins to decline. And of course, post-1991, there's been this rapid sale of enterprises, and now in the Modi regime particularly, literally a fire sale of public sector enterprises. The point here is not just the amount of disinvestment money that is being talked about by government, but that every enterprise that they are selling, they're selling it at way below its worth. If you just look at the assets, for example, BPCL is an example, right? Its net worth is somewhere around 9 lakh crores. What are you selling its shares for? Not even, unimaginably low share of what its real worth is. Look at all the real estate they possess. And the list goes on. So whether it's telecom, chemicals, petrochemicals, aviation, railways, we now have railways, right? We have private entities running trains. Now, are we as a body of public sector officers going to sit by and watch the government destroy the public sector in this country? Or are we going to mount a national campaign? Going to the people, explaining what the public sector is all about, how central it is to self-reliance in the economy, how central it is to reach the unreached. After all, Ashok Rao often is, or chairperson of the National Confederation of Public Sector Officers Associations in the old days, BHL engineer, good friend of mine, he would always tell me about DTC, Delhi Transport Corporation. Delhi Transport Corporation will get the National Productivity Council Productivity Award every year. It will always make losses. Why? Because you subsidize transport. So who are you subsidizing? Are you subsidizing the workers? No. You're subsidizing the employers, because if this transport wasn't available to get the workers, the employers would have organized transport. So there are lots of implicit subsidies that go to the corporate sector. We don't even recognize them as such. We need to call this out. We need to call out all the direct and indirect subsidies and gifts going to the corporate sector in the name of the incentive to invest. And we need to say we don't need to go this route. The state can invest, which means the state mobilizing resources. Ultimately, it is a class question. That the state that we have is unwilling to tax the large corporate entities, just as it is unwilling to move an iota in the direction of any kind of democratic comprehensive land reforms. So, ultimately it is the big capitalist class and the landlord classes that drive government policy. I think we need to recognize that, and we need to then go among the people with our own detailed brochures and pamphlets which explain the key role of the public sector in building modern India. Nehru called it temples of modern India. These guys, of course, have a different notion of what should be done with mosques and temples. So, but we definitely need to today take forward this task of building a powerful campaign among the people, bringing out the enormous contribution made by the public sector and its employees and officers, whether it is in financial sector or in education or in industry or in other sectors. Because everywhere, the three elements of neoliberal reforms, deregulation, privatization and globalization, they're all working in the direction of eliminating public investments in education, healthcare, industry, finance, across the board. And I think we need to expose that and create a powerful counter campaign to explain why public sector enterprises are critical to India's not just development and growth, not just improving supply infrastructure, but even to the very existence of India's economic and political sovereignty. I give you another example which you don't normally think of as public sector, and I'll finish with that. People don't associate green revolution with public sector, right? But in the mid-60s, although we had plans to change agriculture techniques, we had the IAAP and IADP had got off the ground in 1960 itself, the Intensive Agriculture Areas Program and District Program. Don't forget that in the mid-60s, when India as a non-aligned leader had to condemn US intervention in Vietnam and Cambodia, that is when the PL 480 supplies became endangered of rice from the US. And the US president actually, in so many words, said that you are getting PL 480 supplies of rice from us for so cheap, how do you dare criticize us? So that is when we realized that food security is central to economic and political sovereignty. Before it is too late, let us realize that public sector is critical to India's economic and political sovereignty. Thank you. I'll take them one by one. Manoj has asked me two questions. One is about the future of food security of India. And that's an important question because, you see, from 1950 till 1997, more or less, end of the 8th plan, our rate of growth of food grains output was significantly higher than the rate of growth of population. This is quite in sharp contrast to the fact that between 1900 and 1950, while population grew at about 1.5% per annum, food grain output grew by hardly 0.5% per annum. So that first 50 years of the last century was a period of declining per capita food grain output. The 1950 to 97 period was one of rising per capita food grain output in India. Of course, rising food grain output only means greater availability. That doesn't automatically ensure that everybody gets it. So when you talk about food security, we talk about three dimensions at least. One is there enough food available in the country? Second is, do people have access to it? And the third is, does that food get efficiently biologically utilized or absorption? So availability, access and absorption. Now, availability is affected by macroeconomic policies of improving agricultural production, raising productivity. All of this requires substantial public investments in agriculture. In the neoliberal period, there has been a sharp cutback in public support to agriculture and also to the food grain economy. So, despite the fact that, okay, rice and wheat as food grains do receive some amount of procurement protection, not 100%, but some of it. The fact is that public investment has been declining in agriculture. Private investment has not been catching up. And therefore, over the years, there has been a slowing down of the rate of food grain output. And there are periods in the last 30 years when it has actually been lower than the rate of growth of population for several years. So there have been periods of declining per capita food grain output. So availability itself is a challenge. It's not, and especially with the point about climate change that Jayati just mentioned, even availability will be a challenge in the coming period. So we need to really take a fresh look at India's food grain production possibilities and what policy should do to advance that. And then of course you can go beyond rice and wheat and look at nutritious millets, what we sometimes wrongly call inferior cereals, what I prefer to call nutritious millets. But in any event, you'll have to increase food grain output substantially, including cereals and pulses, in order to meet future demand. And all this is only in relation to fairly low levels of consumption now. If people were to be, able to transit to better nutritious consumption, including meat, you will need even more food grain production to also feed the animals that are involved in the process. So we are definitely going to face a challenge on the availability of food grains in the coming periods. That is one. Second thing is access. Now, access of a household to food depends on the income it can obtain. That in turn, very simply, is available either by its having means of production with which it produces its own food, or it produces something else which it sells and buys food with it, or it has productive wage employment. We know that currently in India this is a major issue, that employment levels have not been increasing. Unemployment rates have been rising rapidly. And large proportion of the population in the countryside is also not having any access to land and cannot produce their own food. So we have a major crisis coming up in terms of access to food grains in the coming period, which has to be addressed again by proactive policies which focus on productive employment. And I would say, in fact, that comprehensive land reforms are not irrelevant. They still are part of the agenda of the agrarian revolution in this country. And we will need them to make a difference to access to food grains for the poor in the countryside as well as in the urban areas. Third aspect is absorption, which is about biological utilization. It involves investments in drinking water, sanitation, healthcare, primary education, and so on. There we made some progress, but of course the progress is very uneven and uncertain, and certainly the government's propaganda about advances in drinking water and sanitation are rather exaggerated. But there is some, we have the means to fight it, we can do it. In fact, on all these three dimensions of availability, access, and absorption, the problem is eminently solvable. But it will require a reversal of the neoliberal policies that we've been pursuing for a long time. It will require a much greater focus on self-reliance in food grains production and distribution, and therefore will require a strong role to be played by the state in terms of improved and strong national farm research system, improved and strong extension system, systems and rural investments for storage facilities for farmers, etc. All the other things I talked about earlier in my earlier presentation. This other question is a difficult question. What is the after effect? Too general a question. What is the after effect of new generation online banking system, Facebook, Google, like social media, and so on? Clearly, we are confronting, new means of communication, new technologies of communication, which have potential to do a lot of good, but can also have the potential to do a lot of harm. And social media clearly is an example. You see the kind of trolling we deal with, and also the, entities like Facebook and Google. They operate across the globe, right? And even sovereign countries are unable to control or discipline them to any reasonable extent. So this is a major issue that the European Union is dealing with. How do we deal with Google? How do we deal with Facebook? So I won't offer any comments now. I just think that this is a very complex issue, but at the very minimum, we should be alert to the dangers of control that these agencies have over the production and distribution of communication and information. And you've seen how Twitter and Facebook handle communications in times of crisis. They generally bend to the state, and they generally act against many progressive posts. They suddenly disappear and so on. So it's a very complex issue. I don't want to talk about it now, but what is clear is that this is an area where India needs to collaborate with other countries across the world in disciplining these large monopoly players in the field of information and communication technology. Beyond that, I don't want to say anything now. Then I have two questions. One is, of course, what are the short-term and long-term solutions to the crisis that we have? Let me put it this way. You see, as has already been said, neoliberal reform policies themselves over the last 30 years have greatly increased inequality and have generated a kind of not just a jobless, but a job loss growth, which has led to massive increases in unemployment. And obviously, these must take the basic responsibility for the crisis that we are facing today. But in addition, demonetization and GST have also played a more immediate, more damaging role. So in the short term, immediately, if you're talking about the declining rate of growth and its implications for people, I'm not too concerned about the numbers on the rate of growth of GDP, because often those numbers are unreliable, and in any event, it's not about GDP growth. It's about employment, it's about livelihoods, it's about what happens to people. And those aspects are more important than merely GDP growth rate. So what I would say is that in the immediate short run, as Jayati also said, we need to spend a great deal more money on employment programs, which can also be programs that create assets. For example, the MNREGA, implemented properly, can create a vast network of rural assets. Likewise, in urban areas, there's much infrastructure that needs to be built. And urban shelter, for example, for the poor is a classic example. Affordable housing. Clearly, employment programs would be very helpful there to create affordable housing for the poorer sections of the population in urban centers. So, clearly, both urban and rural mass employment programs with decent wages need to be implemented in order to deal with the immediate problem of a decline in demand. In fact, we didn't mention this when I spoke earlier. In addition to massive disinvestment, using the crisis as an excuse, what is the other thing the government has been doing? Quietly diluting the land acquisition bill, making it easier for corporates to acquire land and expel tribals and primary producers. Likewise, reducing the 40-odd legislations on labor to just 4 codes and using that to attack the very hard-won rights of working people in this country. This is happening silently because we are all focusing on the slowdown and economic crisis, but quietly this is being done on the other side. So one has to be very alert to what this government does. So I would say reverse those things, reverse everything the government has done in the last 1 or 2 years. And we need to, in the short run, increase spending on what could be productive rural and urban employment that creates assets for the future. Simultaneously, increase investment in rural infrastructure considerably and strengthen the public sector in order to be able to move ahead in the future. That's what I would immediately in the short run say. This will help increase demand. It will also help improve the growth of output in the future, because agriculture, one must say one thing very clearly here. The agrarian crisis cannot be solved simply by giving Swaminathan Commission prices. We need to raise productivity in agriculture. And in order to do that, we need a lot of public investment in agriculture. So that is an important form of expenditure that can be urgently taken up. In the long run, we have to get rid of this neoliberal policy framework. There's no other go. In the long run, we have a very strong, unfinished agenda. After all, when we became independent, most of you have forgotten this, even though Kerala was a pioneer. In the freedom movement, we promised the peasantry land to the tiller, right? Subsequently, Kerala has enacted a law that does that. Bengal did that under the left. But across the country, of the 3 dimensions of land reforms, of zamindari abolition, tenancy reform and land ceilings have been a non-starter. You know, Mohanlal estimated in the late 50s that something like 63 million acres will be surplus land. We have not even done 10% of that. We have not even distributed 10% of that quantum. So there's a huge land reforms, land ceilings, land redistribution issue that will not go away. We have to address that across the country. Not relevant for Kerala, but for many other states it will be relevant. Even for Kerala, there is some relevance to this, finally. So this is something in the long run I would put as a high priority item, and I would also put reversal of neoliberal reforms, strong public sector and strong role for the state as important items, and also complete tax reform. Bring back inheritance tax, bring back wealth tax, implement direct tax collection seriously, enforce it, reduce the proportion of indirect taxes in total tax revenue from the present 67% to something like 50%. These are necessary to improve people's purchasing power and to generate tax revenue. Investment will not disappear. Okay. I think this is enough. The other question is too long. Economists say that, because I have a meeting at 2:15, obviously, say that our current crisis, people should begin purchasing power. Will it not only help the big business? If you give people purchasing power and they go out and buy goods, will it only help big business? Why should it? Why should you not also include in this a program of active support for micro, small and medium industries, for developing industries in the countryside itself? So, one can design a program of improving purchasing power, where the purchasing power then gets distributed to a much larger, much wider class of persons than just the big business classes.